Hiber-Nation 48. Grizzly's Growls presents Stories from the Hiber-Nation. Read by David Grizzly Smith. Wild Animals I Have Known by Ernest Thompson Seton, as read by David Grizzly Smith. These stories are true. Although I have left the strict line of historical truth in many places, the animals in this book were all real characters. They lived the lives I've depicted and showed the stamp of heroism and personality more strongly by far than it has been in the power of my pen to tell. I believe that natural history has lost much by the vague general treatment that is so common. What satisfaction would be derived from a 10-page sketch of the habits and customs of man? How much more profitable it would be to devote that space to the life of some one great man. This is the principle I have endeavored to apply to my animals. The real personality of the individual and his view of life are my theme, rather than the ways of the race in general, as viewed by a casual and hostile human eye. Now, this may sound inconsistent in view of my having pieced together some of the characters, but that was made necessary by the fragmentary nature of the records. There is, however, almost no deviation from the truth in Lobo, Bingo, and the Mustang. Lobo lived his wild, romantic life from 1889 to 1894 in the Carrumpaw region, as the ranchmen know too well, and died precisely as related on January 31st, 1894. Bingo was my dog from 1882 to 1888, in spite of interruptions caused by lengthy visits to New York, as my Manitoban friends will remember. And my old friend, the owner of Tan, will learn from these pages how his dog really died. The Mustang lived not too far from Lobo in the early 90s. The story is given strictly as it occurred, except that there is a dispute as to the manner of his death. According to some testimony, he broke his neck in the corral he was first taken to. Old Turkey Track is where he cannot be consulted to settle it. Wooly is, in a sense, a compound of two dogs. Both were mongrels of some collie blood and were raised as sheepdogs. The first part of Wooly is given as it happened. After that, it was known only that he became a savage, treacherous sheep killer. The details of the second part belong really to another, similar yellow dog who lived a double life, faithful sheepdog by day and a bloodthirsty, treacherous monster by night. Such things are less rare than it is supposed, and since writing these stories I've heard of another double-lived sheepdog that added to its night amusements the crowning barbarity of murdering the smaller dogs of the neighborhood. He had killed 20 and hidden them in a sand pit when discovered by his master. He died just as Wooly did. All told, I now have information of 6 of these Jekyll and Hyde dogs. In each case, it happened to be a collie. Redruff really lived in the Don Valley, north of Toronto, and many of my companions will remember him. He was killed in 1888 between the Sugarloaf and Castle Frank by a creature whose name I have withheld, as it is the species rather than the individual that I wish to expose. Silverspot, Raggylug, and Vixen are founded on real characters, though I have ascribed to them the adventures of more than one of their kind. Every incident in the biographies is from life. The fact that these stories are true is the reason why all are tragic. The life of a wild animal always has a tragic end. Such a collection of histories naturally suggests a common thought, a moral, it would have been called in the last century. No doubt each different mind will find a moral to its taste, but I hope some will herein find emphasized a moral as old as Scripture. We and the beasts are kin. Man has nothings that the animals have not at least a vestige of. The animals have nothing that man does not in some degree share. Since, then, the animals are creatures with wants and feelings differing in degree only from our own, they surely have their rights. This fact, now beginning to be recognized by the Caucasian world, was first proclaimed by Moses and was emphasized by the Buddhist over 2,000 years ago. Lobo, the King of the Carrumpaw. Part 1. Carrumpaw is a vast cattle range in northern New Mexico. It is a land of rich pastures and teeming with flocks and herds, a land of rolling mesas and precious running waters that at length unite in the Carrumpaw River, from which the whole region is named. And the king, whose despotic power was felt over its entire extent, was an old gray wolf. Old Lobo, or the king, as the Mexicans called him, was the gigantic leader of a remarkable pack of gray wolves that had ravaged the Carrumpaw Valley for a number of years. All the shepherds and ranchmen knew him well, and wherever he appeared with his trusty band, terror reigned supreme among the cattle, and wrath and despair among their owners. Old Lobo was a giant among wolves, and was cunning and strong in proportion to his size. His voice at night was well known and easily distinguished from that of any of his fellows. An ordinary wolf might howl half the night about the herdsman's bivouac without attracting more than passing notice. But when the deep roar of the old king came booming down the canyon, the watcher bestirred himself and prepared to learn in the morning that fresh and serious inroads had been made among the herds. Old Lobo's band was but a small one. This I never quite understood, for usually when a wolf rises to the position and power that he had, he attracts a numerous following. It may be that he had as many as he desired, or perhaps his ferocious temper prevented the increase of his pack. Certain is it that Lobo had only 5 followers during the latter part of his reign. Each of these, however, was a wolf of renown, and most of them were above ordinary size. One in particular, the second in command, was a veritable giant, but even he was far below the leader in size and prowess. Several of the band, besides the 2 leaders, were especially noted. One of those was a beautiful white wolf that the Mexicans called Blanca. This was supposed to be a female, possibly Lobo's mate. Another was a yellow wolf of remarkable swiftness, which, according to the current stories, had on several occasions captured an antelope for the pack. It will be seen, then, that these wolves were thoroughly well known to the cowboys and shepherds. They were frequently seen and oftener heard, and their lives were intimately associated with those of the cattlemen who would so gladly have destroyed them. There was not a stockman on the Carrumpaw who would not readily have given the value of many steers for the scalp of any one of Lobo's band, but they seemed to possess charmed lives, and defied all manner of devices to kill them. They scorned all hunters, derided all poisons, and continued for at least 5 years to exact their tribute from the Carrumpaw ranchers to the extent, many said, of a cow each day. According to this estimate, therefore, the band had killed more than 2,000 of the finest stock, for, as was only too well known, they selected the best in every instance. The old idea that a wolf was constantly in a starving state and therefore ready to eat anything was as far as possible from the truth in this case, for these freebooters were always sleek and well-conditioned, and were in fact most fastidious about what they ate. Any animal that had died from natural causes, or that was diseased or tainted, they would not touch, and they even rejected anything that had been killed by the stockmen. Their choice and daily food was the tenderer part of a freshly killed yearling heifer. An old bull or cow they disdained, though they occasionally took a young calf or colt. It was quite clear that veal or horse flesh was not their favorite diet. It was also known that they were not fond of mutton, although they often amused themselves by killing sheep. One night in November 1893, Blanca and the yellow wolf killed 250 sheep, apparently for the fun of it, and did not eat an ounce of their flesh. Now, these are examples of many stories which I might repeat to show the ravages of this destructive band. Many new devices for their extinction were tried each year, but still they lived and throve in spite of all the efforts of their foes. A great price was set on Lobo's head, and in consequence poison in a score of subtle forms was put out for him, but he never failed to detect and avoid it. One thing only he feared, that was firearms, and knowing full well that all men in this region carried them, he never was known to attack or face a human being. Indeed, the set policy of his band was to take refuge in flight whenever in the daytime a man was descried, no matter at what distance. Lobo's habit of permitting the pack to eat only that which they themselves had killed was in numerous cases their salvation, and the keenness of his scent to detect the taint of human hands or the poison itself completed their immunity. On one occasion, one of the cowboys heard the too familiar rallying cry of old Lobo, and steadily approaching he found the Carrumpaw pack in a hollow where they had rounded up a small herd of cattle. Lobo sat apart on a knoll, while Blanca, with the rest, was endeavoring to cut out a young cow which they'd selected. But the cattle were standing in a compact mass with their heads outward, and presented to the foe a line of horns, unbroken save when some cow, frightened by a fresh onset of the wolves, tried to retreat into the middle of the herd. It was only by taking advantage of these breaks that the wolves had succeeded at all in wounding the selected cow, but she was far from being disabled, and it seemed that Lobo at length lost patience with his followers, for he left his position on the hill and, uttering a deep roar, dashed toward the herd. The terrified rank broke at his charge, and he sprang in among them. Then the cattle scattered like the pieces of a bursting bomb. Away went the chosen victim, but ere she had gone 25 yards, Lobo was upon her. Seizing her by the neck, he suddenly heeled back with all his force, and so threw her heavily to the ground. The shock must have been tremendous, for the heifer was thrown heels over head. Lobo also turned a somersault, but immediately recovered himself, and his followers, falling on the poor cow, killed her in a few seconds. Lobo took no part in the killing. After having thrown the victim, he seemed to say, "Now why could not some of you have done that at once without wasting so much time?" The man now rode up, shouting. The wolves, as usual, were tired, and he, having a bottle of strychnine, quickly poisoned the carcass in 3 places, then went away, knowing they would return to feed as they had killed the animal themselves. But next morning, on going to look for his expected victims, he found that although the wolves had eaten the heifer, they had carefully cut out and thrown aside all those parts that had been poisoned. The dread of this great wolf spread yearly among the ranchmen, and each year a larger price was set on his head, until at last it reached $1,000, an unparalleled wolf bounty surely. Many a good man has been hunted down for less. Tempted by the promised reward, a Texan ranger named Tannery came one day galloping up the canyon of the Carrumpaw. He had a superb outfit for wolf hunting, the best of guns and horses and a pack of enormous wolfhounds. Far out on the plains of the Panhandle, he and his dogs had killed many a wolf. Now he never doubted that within a few days old Lobo's scalp would dangle at his saddle bow. Well, away they went bravely on their hunt in the gray dawn of a summer morning. Soon the great dogs gave joyous tongue to say that they were already on the track of their quarry. Within 2 miles, the grisly band of Carrumpaw leaped into view, and the chase grew fast and furious. The part of the wolfhounds was merely to hold the wolves at bay till the hunter could ride up and shoot them, and this usually was easy on the open plains of Texas, but here was a new feature of the country that came into play, showed how well Lobo had chosen his range. For the rocky canyons of the Carrumpaw and its tributaries intersect the prairies in every direction. The old wolf at once made for the nearest of these, and by crossing it, got rid of the horsemen. His band then scattered, thereby scattered the dogs, and when they reunited at a distant point, of course, all the dogs did not turn up, and the wolves, no longer outnumbered, turned on their pursuers and killed or desperately wounded them all. That night, when Tannery mustered his dogs, only 6 of them returned, and of these, 2 were terribly lacerated. This hunter made 2 other attempts to capture the royal scalp, but neither of them was more successful than the first, and on the last occasion his best horse met its death by a fall. So he gave up the chase in disgust and went back to Texas, leaving Lobo more than ever the despot of the region. Well, next year, 2 other hunters appeared, determined to win the promised bounty. Each believed he could destroy this noted wolf, first by means of a newly devised poison, which was to be laid out in an entirely new manner, the other by a French-Canadian, by poison assisted with certain spells and charms, for he firmly believed that Lobo was a veritable loup-garou and could not be killed by ordinary means. But cunningly compounded poisons, charms, and incantations were all of no avail against this grisly devastator. He made his weekly rounds and daily banquets as aforetime, and before many weeks had passed, Cologne and Loche gave up in despair and went elsewhere to hunt. In the spring of 1893, after his unsuccessful attempt to capture Lobo, Joe Cologne had a humiliating experience, which seems to show that the big wolf simply scorned his enemies and had absolute confidence in himself. Cologne's farm was on a small tributary of the Carrumpaw in a picturesque canyon, and among the rocks of this very canyon, within 1,000 yards of the house, old Lobo and his mate selected their den and raised their family that season. There they lived all summer and killed Joe's cattle, sheep, and dogs, but laughed at all his poisons and traps and rested securely among the recesses of the cavernous cliffs, while Joe vainly racked his brain for some method of smoking them out or of reaching them with dynamite. But they escaped, entirely unscathed, and continued their ravages as before. "There's where he lived all last summer," said Joe, pointing to the face of the cliff, "and I couldn't do a thing with him. I was like a fool to him." Part 2. This history gathered so far from the cowboys I found hard to believe until the fall of 1893 I made the acquaintance of the wily marauder, and at length came to know him more thoroughly than anyone else. Some years before, in the bingo days, I had been a wolf hunter, but my occupation since then had been of another sort, chaining me to stool and desk. I was much in need of a change, and when a friend, who was also a ranch owner on the Carrumpaw, asked me to come to New Mexico and try if I could do anything with his predatory pack, I accepted the invitation, and, eager to make the acquaintance of its king, was soon as possible among the mesas of that region. I spent some time riding about to learn the country, and at intervals my guide would point to the skeleton of a cow to which the hide still adhered, and remark, "That's some of his work." It became quite clear to me that in this rough country it was useless to think of pursuing Lobo with hounds and horses, so that poison or traps were the only available expedients. At present we had no traps large enough, so I set to work with poison. I need not enter into the details of 100 devices I employed to circumvent this loup-garou. There was no combination of strychnine, arsenic, cyanide, or prussic acid that I did not essay. There was no manner of flesh that I did not try as bait. But morning after morning, as I rode forth to learn the result, I found that all my efforts had been useless. The old king was too cunning for me. A single instance will show his wonderful sagacity. Acting on the hint of an old trapper, I melted some cheese together with the kidney fat from a freshly killed heifer, stewing it in a china dish and cutting it with a bone knife to avoid the taint of metal. When the mixture was cool, I cut it into lumps. Making a hole in one side of each lump, I inserted a large dose of strychnine and cyanide, contained in a capsule that was impermeable by any odor. Finally, I sealed the holes up with pieces of the cheese itself. During the whole process, I wore a pair of gloves steeped in the hot blood of the heifer, even avoided breathing on the baits. When all was ready, I put them in a rawhide bag rubbed all over with blood, and rode forth dragging the liver and kidneys of the beef at the end of a rope. With this I made a 10-mile circuit, dropping a bait at each quarter of a mile, and taking the utmost care always not to touch any with my hands. Lobo generally came into this part of the range in the early part of each week, and passed the latter part, it was supposed, around the base of the Sierra Grande. This was Monday. That same evening, as we were about to retire, I heard the deep bass howl of His Majesty. On hearing it, one of the boys briefly remarked, "There he is, we'll see." The next morning I went forth, eager to know the result. I soon came on the fresh trail of the robbers, with Lobo in the lead. His track was always easily distinguished. An ordinary wolf's forefoot is 4.5 inches long, that of a large wolf 4 3/4 inches, but Lobo's, as measured a number of times, was 5.5 inches from claw to heel. I afterward found that his other proportions were commensurate, for he stood 3 feet high at the shoulder, and weighed 150 pounds. His trail, therefore, though obscured by those of his followers, was never difficult to trace. The pack had soon found the track of my drag, and, as usual, followed it. I could see that Lobo had come to the first bait, sniffed about it, and finally picked it up. Then I could not conceal my delight. "I've got him at last," I exclaimed. "I shall find him stark within a mile." And I galloped on with eager eyes fixed on the great broad track in the dust. It led me to the second bait, and that was also gone. How I exulted! I surely have him now, and perhaps several of his band. But there was the broad paw mark still on the drag, and though I stood in the stirrup and scanned the plain, I saw nothing that looked like a dead wolf. Again I followed, to find now that the third bait was gone, and the king wolf's track led on to the fourth. There to learn that he had not really taken a bait at all, but had merely carried them in his mouth. Then, having piled the 3 on the 4th, he scattered filth over them to express his utter contempt for my devices. After this he left my drag and went about his business with the pack he guarded so effectively. This is only one of many similar experiences which convinced me that poison would never avail to destroy this robber. And though I continued to use it while awaiting the arrival of the traps, it was only because it was meanwhile a sure means of killing many prairie wolves and other destructive vermin. About this time there came under my observation an incident that will illustrate Lobo's diabolic cunning. These wolves had at least one pursuit which was merely an amusement. It was stampeding and killing sheep, though they rarely ate them. The sheep are usually kept in flocks of from 1,000 to 3,000 under one or more shepherds. At night they're gathered in the most sheltered place available, and a herdsman sleeps on each side of the flock to give additional protection. Sheep are such senseless creatures that they are liable to be stampeded by the veriest trifle, but they have deeply ingrained in their nature one, perhaps only one, strong weakness, namely, to follow their leader. And this the shepherds turned to good account by putting 6 goats in the flock of sheep. The latter recognized the superior intelligence of their bearded cousins, and when a night alarm occurs they crowd around them, and usually are thus saved from a stampede and are easily protected. But it was not always so. One night, late in last November, 2 Perico shepherds were aroused by an onset of wolves. Their flocks huddled around the goats, which, being neither fools nor cowards, stood the ground and were bravely defiant. But alas for them, no common wolf was heading this attack. Old Lobo, the werewolf, knew as well as the shepherds that the goats were the moral force of the flock. So, hastily running over the backs of the densely packed sheep, he fell on these leaders and slew them all in a few minutes, and soon had the luckless sheep stampeding in 1,000 different directions. For weeks afterward I was almost daily accosted by some anxious shepherd who asked, "Have you seen any Sreoto sheep lately?" And usually I was obliged to say I had. One day it was, yes, I came on 5 or 6 carcasses by Diamond Springs. Or another, it was to the effect I'd seen a small bunch running on the Malpai Mesa. Or again, no, but Juan Mira saw about 20 freshly killed on the Cedra Monte 2 days ago. Well, at length the wolf traps arrived, and with 2 men I worked a whole week to get them properly set out. We spared no labor or pains. I adopted every device I could think of that might help to ensure success. The second day after the traps arrived, I rode around to inspect, and soon came upon Lobo's trail, running from trap to trap. In the dust I could read the whole story of his doings that night. He had trotted along in the darkness, and although the traps were so carefully concealed, he had instantly detected the first one. Stopping the onward march of the pack, he had cautiously scratched around it until he had disclosed the trap, the chain, and the log, and then left them wholly exposed to view with the trap still unsprung, and passing on he treated over 12 traps in the same fashion. Very soon, I noticed, he stopped and turned aside as soon as he detected suspicious signs on the trail, and a new plan to outwit him at once suggested itself. I set the traps in the form of an H, that is, with a row of traps on each side of the trail, and one on the trail for the crossbar of the H. Well, before long I had the opportunity to count another failure. Lobo came trotting along the trail, and was fairly between the parallel lines before he detected the single trap in the trail, but he stopped in time, and why or how he knew enough I cannot tell. The angel of the wild things must have been with him, but without turning an inch to the right or left, he slowly and cautiously backed on his own tracks, putting his paw exactly in its old track until he was off the dangerous ground. Then, returning at one side, he scratched clods and stones with his hind feet till he had sprung every trap. This he did on many other occasions, and although I varied my methods and redoubled my precautions, he never was deceived. His sagacity seemed ever at fault, and he might have been pursuing his career of rapine today, but for an unfortunate alliance that proved his ruin and added his name to the long list of heroes who, unassailable when alone, have fallen through the indiscretion of a trusted ally. Part 3. Once or twice I had found indications that everything was not quite right in the Carrumpaw pack. There were signs of irregularity, I thought. For instance, there was clearly the trail of a smaller wolf running ahead of the leader at times, and this I could not understand until a cowboy made a remark which explained the matter. "I saw them today," he said, "and the wild one that breaks away is Blanca." Well, then the truth dawned on me, and I added, "Now I know that Blanca is a she-wolf, because were a he-wolf to act thus, Lobo would kill him at once." Well, this suggested a new plan. I killed a heifer, set one or two rather obvious traps about the carcass. Then, cutting off the head, which is considered useless offal and quite beneath the notice of the wolf, I set it a little apart, and around it placed 6 powerful steel traps, properly deodorized and concealed with the utmost care. During my operations I kept my hands, boots, and implements smeared with fresh blood, and afterwards sprinkled the ground with the same, as though it had flowed from the head. And when the traps were buried in the dust, I brushed the place over with the skin of a coyote, and with a foot of the same animal made a number of tracks over the traps. The head was so placed that there was a narrow passage between it and some tussocks, and in this passage I buried 2 of my best traps, fastening them to the head itself. Wolves have a habit of approaching every carcass they get the wind of in order to examine it, even when they have no intention of eating it, and I hoped that this habit would bring the Carrumpaw pack within reach of my latest stratagem. I did not doubt that Lobo would detect my handiwork about the meat and prevent the pack approaching it, but I dimmed some hopes on the head, for it looked as though it had been thrown aside as useless. Next morning I sallied forth to inspect the traps, and there, oh joy, were the tracks of the pack, and the place where the beef head and the traps had been was empty. A hasty study of the trail showed that Lobo had kept the pack from approaching the meat, but one, a small wolf, had evidently gone on to examine the head as it lay apart and walked right into one of those traps. We set out on the trail, and within a mile discovered that the hapless wolf was Blanca. Away she went, however, at a gallop, and although encumbered by the beef head, which weighed over 50 pounds, she speedily distanced my companion, who was on foot. But we overtook her when she reached the rocks, for the horns of the cow's head became caught and held her fast. She was the handsomest wolf I had ever seen. Her coat was in perfect condition, nearly white. She turned to fight, and raising her voice in the rallying cry of her race, sent a long howl rolling over the canyon. From far away upon the mesa came a deep response, the cry of old Lobo. That was her last call. From now we had closed in on her, and all her energy and breath was devoted to combat. Then followed the inevitable tragedy, the idea of which I shrank from afterward more than at the time. We each threw a lasso over the neck of the doomed wolf, and strained our horses in opposite directions until the blood burst from her mouth, her eyes glazed, her limbs stiffened, and then fell limp. Homeward then we rode, carrying the dead wolf, and exulting over this, the first death blow we had been able to inflict on the Carrumpaw pack. At intervals during the tragedy, and afterward as we rode homeward, we heard the roar of Lobo as he wandered about on the distant mesas, where he seemed to be searching for Blanca. He'd never really deserted her, but knowing that he could not save her, his deep-rooted dread of firearms had been too much for him when he saw us approaching. All that day we heard him wailing as he roamed in his quest, and I remarked at length to one of the boys, "Now indeed I truly know that Blanca was his mate." As evening fell, he seemed to be coming toward the home canyon, for his voice sounded continually nearer. There was an unmistakable note of sorrow in it now. It was no longer the loud, defiant howl, but a long, plaintive wail. "Blanca, Blanca," he seemed to call. And as the night came down, I noticed he was not far from the place where we had overtaken her. At length he seemed to find the trail, and when he came to the spot where we had killed her, his heartbroken wailing was piteous to hear. It was sadder than I could possibly have believed. Even the stolid cowboys noticed it and said they had never heard a wolf carry on like that before. Seemed to know exactly what had taken place, for her blood had stained the place of her death. Well, then he took up the trail of the horses and followed it to the ranch house. Whether in hopes of finding her there or in quest of revenge, I know not, but the latter was what he found, for he surprised our unfortunate watchdog outside and tore him to little bits within 50 yards of the door. He evidently came alone this time, for I found but one trail next morning, and he'd galloped about in a reckless manner that was very unusual with him. I had half expected this, and had set a number of additional traps about the pasture. Afterward I found he had indeed fallen into one of these, but such was his strength, he had torn himself loose and cast it aside. I believed he would continue in the neighborhood until he found her body at least, so I concentrated all my energies on this one enterprise of catching him before he left the region, while yet in this reckless mood. Then I realized what a mistake I had made in killing Blanca, for by using her as a decoy I might have secured him the next night. I gathered in all the traps I could command, 130 strong steel wolf traps, and set them in fours in every trail that led into the canyon. Each trap was separately fastened to a log, and each log was separately buried. In burying them, I carefully removed the sod, and every particle of earth that was lifted we put in blankets, so that after the sod was replaced and all was finished, the eye could detect no trace of human handiwork. When the traps were concealed, I trailed the body of poor Blanca over each place, made of it a drag that circled all about the ranch. Finally, I took off one of her paws and made with it a line of tracks over each trap. Every precaution and device known to me I used, and retired at a late hour to await the result. Once, during the long night, I thought I heard old Lobo, but was not sure of it. Next day I rode around, but darkness came on before I completed the circuit of the North Canyon, and I had nothing to report. At supper, one of the cowboys said, "There's a great row among the cattle in the North Canyon this morning. Maybe there's something in the traps there." It was afternoon to the next day before I got to the place referred to, and as I drew near, a great grisly form arose from the ground, vainly endeavoring to escape, and there, revealed before me, stood Lobo, king of the Carrumpaw, firmly held in the traps. Poor old hero, he had never ceased to search for his darling, and when he found the trail her body had made, he followed it recklessly, and so fell into the snare prepared for him. There he lay in the iron grasp of all 4 traps, perfectly helpless, and all around him were numerous tracks showing how the cattle had gathered about him to insult the fallen despot, without daring to approach within his reach. For 2 days and 2 nights he'd lain there, and now was worn out with struggling. Yet when I went near him, he rose up with bristling mane and raised his voice, and for the last time made the canyon reverberate with his deep bass roar, a call for help, the muster call of his band. But there was none to answer him, and left alone in his extremity, he whirled about with all his strength and made a desperate effort to get at me. All in vain. Each trap was a dead drag of over 300 pounds, and in their relentless fourfold grasp, with great steel jaws on every foot, and the heavy logs and chains all entangled together, he was absolutely powerless. How his huge ivory tusks did grind on those cruel chains! And when I ventured to touch him with my rifle barrel, he left grooves on it which are there to this day. His eyes glared green with hate and fury, and his jaws snapped with a hollow chop as he vainly endeavored to reach me and my trembling horse. But he was worn out with hunger and struggling and loss of blood, and he soon sank exhausted to the ground. Something like compunction came over me as I prepared to deal out to him that which so many had suffered at his hands. Grand old outlaw, hero of 1,000 lawless raids, in a few minutes you'll be a great load of carrion. It cannot be otherwise. But then I swung my lasso and sent it whistling over his head, but not so fast. He was yet far from being subdued, and before the supple coils had fallen on his neck, he seized the noose and with one fierce chop cut through its hard, thick strands and dropped it in 2 pieces at his feet. Of course I had my rifle as a last resource, but I did not wish to spoil his royal hide, so I galloped back to the camp and returned with a cowboy and a fresh lasso. We threw to our victim a stick of wood which he seized in his teeth, and before he could relinquish it, our lassos whistled through the air and tightened on his neck. Yet before the light had died from his fierce eyes, I cried, "Stay, we will not kill him. Let us take him alive to the camp." He was so completely powerless now that it was easy to put a stout stick through his mouth, behind his tusks, and then lash his jaws with a heavy cord which was also fastened to the stick. The stick kept the cord in, and the cord kept the stick in, so he was harmless. Soon as he felt his jaws were tied, he made no further resistance, uttered no sound, but looked calmly at us and seemed to say, "Well, you've got me at last. Do as you please with me." And from that time he took no more notice of us. We tied his feet securely, but he never groaned or growled or turned his head. Then, with our united strength, we were just able to put him on my horse. His breath came evenly, as though sleeping, and his eyes were bright and clear again, but did not rest on us. Afar on the great rolling mesas they were fixed, his passing kingdom, where his famous band was now scattered, and he gazed till the pony descended the pathway into the canyon, and the rocks cut off the view. But traveling slowly, we reached the ranch in safety, and after securing him with a collar and a strong chain, we staked him out in the pasture and removed the cords. Then, for the first time, I could examine him closely, and proved how unreliable is vulgar report when a living hero or tyrant is concerned. He had not a collar of gold about his neck, nor was there on his shoulders an inverted cross to denote that he had leagued himself with Satan. But I did find on one haunch a great broad scar, the tradition says was the fang mark of Juno, the leader of Tenere's wolf-hounds. a mark which she gave him the moment before he stretched her lifeless on the sand of the canyon. I set meat and water beside him, but he paid no heed. He lay calmly on his breast and gazed with those steadfast yellow eyes away past me, down through the gateway of the canyon, over the open plains, his plains, nor moved a muscle when I touched him. But when the sun went down, he was still gazing fixedly across the prairie. I expected he would call up his band when night came, and prepared for them, but he had called once in his extremity, and none had come. He would never call again. A lion shorn of his strength, an eagle robbed of his freedom, a dove bereft of his mate, all die, it is said, of a broken heart. And who will aver that this grim bandit could bear the threefold brunt, heart whole? This only I know, that when the morning dawned, he was lying there still, in his position of calm repose, his body unwounded, but his spirit was gone. The old king wolf was dead. I took the chain from his neck, and a cowboy helped me carry him to the shed, where lay the remains of Blanca, and as we laid him beside her, the cattleman exclaimed, "There, you had come to her. Now you're together again." Thank you for listening to Stories from the Hiber-Nation. Comment on the website at grizzliesgrowls.com. This program is offered under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.